Welcome back to The Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I'm David Kern. Today's poem is by W.H. Auden, an English poet who lived from 1907 to 1973. You've heard of him a few times on this podcast. He is best known for poems like September 1st, 1939 and The Shield of Achilles. The poem that I'm going to read today is a short poem called Epitaph on a Tyrant. It was recommended to me by A.M. Juster, who is the poetry editor of First Things magazine. I'd read it before, but when he mentioned it again, I thought, this is one I have to share on the show. It is only 6 lines long, so this will not be a long episode, but this is a very interesting poem. And again, this is Epitaph on a Tyrant by W.H. Auden. This is from a collection called Another Time, which was published in 1940. This is how it goes. Perfection of a kind was what he was after, and the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand, and was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter. And when he cried, the little children died in the streets. This is one of those poems that packs such a punch because of its turn. But it's also one of those turns that it builds up to. Reputedly, I have read in a very little bit of research on this poem for this episode that Auden wrote this in the late 30s when he was living in Germany during the, well, not the rise of Hitler, I suppose, but the peak of Hitler's power. And the poem begins with a very interesting contrast, a moment of contrariness, if you will. Perfection is our opening line, our opening word, rather. But then it sort of subverts itself by saying, of a kind, perfection, of a kind was what he was after. This tyrant, for whom the epitaph has been written, was after a kind of perfection. And the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand. Auden's use of that cliche there, the idea of the back of the hand, is so interesting. Because Auden's he's not a poet who made his legacy on cliches, obviously. So that's purposeful there. He's speaking in, it's kind of jingoistic in some ways. He's speaking like a speech maker, sort of. He's speaking in common parlance. And I think that has to have something to do with this concept of the tyrant, who makes these grand claims about the concept of perfection even. And those claims are unfulfillable, right? They're not real. I mean, they're not attainable. And they're not tied to anything real. And so he has to speak in a kind of, poetry that doesn't take thought to accept. That kind of poetry that speaks to emotion primarily, that demands an immediate response, because that immediate response is what wins people over, or at least convinces people to do what you ask. And so I don't think that it's surprising that he then leads into the fourth line about being interested in armies and fleets, because of course he's interested in armies and fleets. And then we get a semicolon, and we get this note about when he laughs, respectable senators burst with laughter. Because of course they did. I mean, they want to survive, right? But then that gut punch of the final line, because it all builds up to that, right? The idea of when he cried, the little children died in the streets. He contrasts laughter and crying. He doesn't contrast rage and kindness or anything like that. It's laughter and crying. It's laughter and tears. And I find that fascinating and moving. And certainly, I think chilling is a good word for that. The blog Interesting Literature has a blog post about this poem and many others. They occasionally have some interesting things that are worth checking out. And I'll just read this bit here. I'll just read a couple sentences here. I think this is interesting. It says, quote, Auden turns a familiar phrase inside out, evoking and then evicting the lines of the New Testament. But Jesus said, suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19:14. There's nothing Christ-like about this tyrant. He will not suffer the little children to come unto him. The little children instead will be the ones to suffer. But Auden is also inverting a specific phrase by the 19th century writer John Lothrop Motley in The Rise of the Dutch Republic from 1859, citing a 1584 report about the death of the Dutch ruler William the Silent, which said, as long as he lived, he was the guiding star of a whole brave nation, and when he died, the little children cried in the streets. And then the blog post goes on to say, it is not necessary to get this very precise allusion, of course, but inverting that last line does help to bring into sharper focus the contrast Auden is making between a kindly ruler and an evil tyrant. Epitaph on a Tyrant, the blog post goes on, like many of Auden's poems of the 1930s, was inspired by the appalling events of that decade, but it also neatly encapsulates the qualities and behavior of all tyrants, from Herod to Henry VIII to Hitler. End quote. So again, as is so often the case with Auden, we get universal truth expressed through very particular allusions. Auden was nothing if not well read, and something of an inspiration, I suppose, in that way. All right, short poem, I'll read one more time for you. This is Epitaph on a Tyrant by W.H. Auden. Perfection of a kind was what he was after, and the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand, and was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets. This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. Be back tomorrow with another